Howdy folks, and welcome to the Hillbilly Kitchen. Today we're going to be making homemade bread. I've been wanting to do this video for y'all for a very long time, but it's taken a considerable amount of thought to put this video together enough so that I can get all the kind of tips and tricks and techniques in so that you can make a really good loaf of bread at home yourself. I'm doing it now, obviously, because we're in the midst of massive shortages and lockdowns and stuff, and a lot of people just simply cannot find bread. So the basic bread, basically what you need is flour, yeast, salt, and water. That's all you need for basic homemade bread. And there are some substitutions you can do. I know a lot of people have not been able to find yeast, and you can actually use warm beer and make your bread rise with that because it has yeast in it. But that's another recipe kind of entirely. There's quite a few substitutions you have to do in that. There are a lot of things that you can add in bread that will change it and make it better, change the texture, change the flavor. There are also a lot of things that you can do to it that will change it. So I'm going to cover as many of those as possible. And I want to start this by letting you know that bread recipes and bread making, it's not exact. You've heard the term artisan bread. Well, that's because making bread is kind of an art form. You have to learn how it feels, how it smells, how it tastes, what it looks like. And as you make a few loaves, you'll develop a recipe that you really like. You'll get the technique down to get the result that you want in the end. So if the first loaf of bread you make doesn't come out perfect, don't think that you're never going to be able to do it, because it really does take a little bit of time to develop a feel for it. It's like anything else that you learn to do, like cross stitch, for example. Somebody will teach you the stitches, but eventually you have to figure out exactly how tight to pull the thread in order to make the finished product look right. If you over pull it, obviously it pulls the fabric and it doesn't look right. If you don't pull it tight enough, well, your whole thing is just kind of a mess and it doesn't look right. Alright, now we're going to get started making our bread. You want a little bit of sugar or some kind of sweetener in it to feed your yeast. Not necessarily an absolute, but it sure enough is going to help. And I've got less than a teaspoon of sugar. I'm going to add that into my water. And I know a lot of recipes say get out a thermometer and check the temperature of your water and everything. You can. I use this. It should be very warm but not burn you. And as long as it's very warm but doesn't burn you, your yeast will dissolve and it will rise and it will work like it should. If it's too hot, it'll kill your yeast because your yeast is alive. And I know there's a lot of recipes that don't dissolve the yeast in the water before they add it to the flour. I always dissolve it, and especially now with shortages, it's a good idea because you don't want to waste 3 cups of flour or more and all the other ingredients that you put in your bread. And you just kind of want to stir that enough to dissolve it a little bit. You don't have to go crazy with it. And what's going to happen after this sits here about 5 minutes is it's going to get really, really foamy. If it doesn't get foamy, your yeast is dead and your bread won't rise. Okay, a lot of people are concerned about salt. You really, really need some salt in your bread. If you don't have any salt in your bread, it will rise too much. It'll just continue to rise and rise and rise, and it won't have the right texture to it. But you definitely don't want to put too much salt, because if you put too much salt, it won't rise at all. It adds a lot of flavor, and it, like I said, it helps stop the rising at a certain point. Basically a teaspoon per loaf or a little bit less is good. You don't want to go lower than 3/4 of a teaspoon, and you don't want to go more than 2 teaspoons. So I'm going to go ahead and dump in 3 cups of my flour, or about 3 cups. And you want to measure out your flour, weigh it or measure it, whatever the recipe calls for. I'm using 3.5 cups of flour, because the biggest problem with bread is that you put too much flour in it and it gets too dense. So go ahead and add your salt to your flour and give it a little whisk. You can do this with a fork if you want, but you want to mix it up a little bit. And like I said, you don't want to leave out that salt. If you leave it out, it won't have any flavor, and it'll overrise, and then it can fall, and that's just not good. Okay, so that's the basic ingredients. I want to add a little bit to mine because I want it to have a little bit different texture than just the basic bread. You want a cup of liquid. Now, I'm doing half water and half milk. Milk does a few things in your bread. It will make it more moist. It will make it a tiny bit sweeter because the yeast doesn't eat up the lactose in the milk. Now, you can use all water, and you can add some powdered milk. Just use a cup of water and add about half a cup of powdered milk to it. That's fine, or a quarter cup of powdered milk. Adjust that. That's one of those things you can adjust to get the texture that you want. Something else that I really like is a little bit of potato starch in mine. And I've been using just plain instant potato flakes. You want to make sure it's 100% potato flakes if you have that. And if you're doing the plain instant potato flakes, about a half a cup in this recipe. But I got some potato flour, which is 100% potato again. It's finely ground. If you're using the potato flour, you only want to use about a quarter of a cup. So I'm going to go ahead and add that to my flour mixture. Now what that's going to do is it's going to make it softer and more moist. And it does add a little flavor to it. It's not going to make it taste like a mashed potato or a baked potato, but I really like the flavor that it puts in bread. And most of us have had potato bread or potato rolls or something like that. So you know kind of what the potato does to it. It's, like I said, it's not going to overpower it, but it does make it a little more moist. And I like that. Something else you can add in your bread is an egg. Now, an egg will make it softer, and it will make it lighter, and it will make it rise a little bit more. You know, in cakes and pies and stuff like that, the egg makes them rise more. An egg also has gluten in it, which will help your bread stick together, make it more moist, and it really gives it a lighter texture. Per loaf, about 1 egg. I mean, you might make it decide you want to add 2 eggs, but that's up to you. So I'm going to go ahead and add my egg to my milk because that's a wet ingredient. I'm just kind of combining my wet ingredients. And you can see here, my yeast is now this much liquid and this much foam. It's literally almost half foam and half liquid. So this is definitely good yeast. And you'll see that same thing. You just stir it up and let it sit there for a minute. It really doesn't take long at all. Now, the other thing I'm going to add to mine is I want it a little bit sweeter. Not super sweet, and you have to be careful sweetening it. If you add a little, it will help it rise because it will feed your yeast and make it grow. If you add too much though, it will actually make it fall, and it will make it very dense and heavy, and it just won't be good at all. About the most you want to add is a tablespoon per cup of flour, whether you're using sugar or honey. Now, I think honey not only makes it sweeter, but it also adds flavor to it. So I'm going to add about 2 tablespoons of honey, which is plenty in a loaf of bread. It will give it that sweet flavor, and honey also kind of helps improve the shelf life of it. It makes it a little more stable after it's baked, and it'll last a little bit longer. So I'm just going to add about 2 tablespoons of honey. Now I'm going to bust up my egg and kind of mix my honey in with my milk. You do want anything liquid that you add to this warm. So my water was warm. I warmed my milk up just a little bit. You want it at about that same temperature. If you can touch it and it feels really warm but it doesn't burn you, that's the right temperature. The other thing you can add into your bread is a little bit of fat. Now, fat does a lot of things in food. It definitely makes it more moist, and it makes it less crumbly. If you don't put any fat at all in your bread, it's going to be pretty dry and it's going to crumble. I mean, like crumble really bad. But again, if you get too much fat, it's going to be way too dense and it's not going to be good. About 2 tablespoons. I'm going to do about the same amount of fat as I did honey. So the fat and the sweetness, I think, about equal, makes it good. You can add a little more. You don't want to go too much. Really, any more than about 2 tablespoons is going to make it, it's not going to be good. Again, you're going to get into that dense, not just moist. You can use any kind of oil in this, but butter and olive oil add more flavor, and you're going to need a little bit more oil or butter, some kind of fat, to kind of wipe on the outside of your dough once you get it kneaded. So I'm just going to kind of add this into my warm milk and stuff. It's already soft, it's at room temperature, and it probably isn't going to dissolve all the way in here. I'll have to mix it in the bread, but that's okay. Alright, now my yeast is about to rise out of the top of my cup here. So I'm going to go ahead and combine this yeast with my 3 cups of flour and my salt. And I'm going to kind of just mix it together a little bit. There's a lot of recipes that have you adding this in just a little bit of flour and then letting it sit. And you can certainly do that. You can mix your yeast with about a cup of flour, and you can just let it sit for a couple of hours before you start making your bread. That's called a sponge, and that gives your yeast time to really work. If you've got time to do that, that's good. It will make the bread more flavorful. The longer you let your yeast work, the more flavor your bread will have. Okay, now I'm going to dump the rest of my wet ingredients in here, and like I said, you can let that yeast sit there for an hour or 2, even just like that, just the yeast and the flour. If you have a stand mixer, you can mix this in your stand mixer, and it's much easier than hand kneading. It takes less time. Once the ingredients are combined, you want to put your dough hook on, and you will run it in your stand mixer 5 to 8 minutes. Now, if you're kneading it by hand and you don't have a stand mixer, you're going to knead it for about 15 minutes, possibly even longer, to get it the correct consistency. Okay, once you've got the ingredients kind of combined, now you're going to sort of start kneading it. Now, I don't want to dump it out of my bowl just yet, mainly just because of the mess. I'm just going to use my spatula and kind of go around and scrape my bowl, because I do want to put my bread back in this bowl to rise, so I don't want it in a mess. And I'm going to use it and use a hand to kind of finish combining these ingredients and get them all stuck together. If you've got kind of a bigger flat bowl like this, it helps, but you don't necessarily have to have one. my dad used to use a potato masher when he made bread when I was a kid to do this part of the mixing. If you happen to have some of these little vinyl cutting board things, they are great for rolling your dough out on. Now, if you're doing like 2 or 3 loaves of bread, you're going to have something bigger than this, obviously. But I find this makes cleaning up much easier than scraping the countertop. If you fold this out on the countertop, you're going to have a dough scraper to clean it off, or you're going to be scrubbing for a while. So I just want a little flour on this, not much, because like I said, the tendency is to work in far more flour than you need, especially if you're doing it by hand. Now, if you were mixing this in a stand mixer and you had the dough hook going, it would just start pulling away from the sides of the bowl, and it would form a nice ball, and the more it mixed, the less stickier it would get. When you're doing it by hand, it's a little bit different, and it tends to stay sticky a little longer. But resist that urge to add more flour. And like I said, it's hard to do an exact bread recipe because a lot of things affect flour. Humidity, temperature, and the yeast. They're going to be affected by all sorts of weather conditions. Even barometric pressure affects it. So it's going to change a little bit every time you make it, unless you have ideal and exact weather conditions from one time to the next. And that's not too likely to happen. You can see it's not too sticky, and I'm probably not going to add any more flour at all, even though once I start kneading it, it's going to get a little bit stickier. But then it will get unsticky as I continue to knead it. Basically, to knead it, you just turn it and fold it and push it. And you kind of use the heel of your hand to do it, because what you're doing is you're breaking up the gluten in the flour and causing it to form strands, and that's what holds your bread together. That's part of why gluten-free bread is so hard to make, because it doesn't have those gluten strands. And gluten-free bread usually has quite a few eggs in it. Different kind of gluten, not wheat gluten, but it does have gluten in it. You just do it in the form of the eggs. The egg yolks have a lot of fat in them too. So if you're adding an egg, like I did, you definitely want to be careful with the fat. You don't want to add too much fat with the egg yolk, or it will keep your bread from rising. Now, if you're kneading this by hand, you're going to do this for about 15 minutes. So pace yourself. And like I said, this is maybe it's a hobby you'll want to take up. You know, times are pretty stressful. This can definitely relieve some stress. Okay, I'm going to add a little more flour to my dough now. I've been kneading it for maybe 5 minutes, but you can see it's really sticking to my hand and to my little vinyl mat here I'm working on. You don't want it to stick this much, because what it's doing is it's tearing all those gluten bonds that you're trying to build by kneading it. So just add a little more flour. Don't get carried away. Just a few tablespoons at a time. Like I said, you don't want it sticking this much because you don't want it to tear your gluten bonds, but you don't want to add too much. And I never go over 3.5 cups in this recipe, because that would give you that dense, not good stuff. That's why I measure it out. So it's going to be anywhere between 3 and 3.5 cups of flour that you'll use in it. Okay, after I added my 2 ounces of flour, my dough was really dry and nice and easy to work with for quite a while. I kneaded it more, and now once again it's sticking to my little vinyl mat, and it's starting to tear. So I'm going to add just a tiny bit more flour. It is raining today, so it's pretty humid, And I might actually have to use all of this, but I really, like I said, I don't want to. And maybe just another tablespoon there. Now, if your dough gets sticky like this when you're kneading it, you might have to stop and clean your surface if you don't have a dough scraper. If you don't have a dough scraper, they actually sell these at the Dollar Tree, and they are the exact same thing that they sell in professional kitchen supply places for a whole lot of money. It's just a flat blade with a curved handle, and what it does is it cleans up the dough off the work area, and that way it doesn't stick where it was sticking before. If you don't do that, once you knead it a little bit and need that flour in there, any dough that's left on the area where you're working, whether it's your counter or vinyl mat, wax paper, whatever, it will stick back to that. And you can do this on wax paper, but after you knead it for a while, the wax paper kind of gets worn out, so you might not be able to completely knead it all on one piece of wax paper. The big danger when you're hand kneading is that you get too much flour. You're not really going to over knead it. The big danger when you're using a stand mixer is that you over knead it, you over process it. Okay, this is starting to look pretty good, and it's starting to get really rubbery, which is what I want. I want it to bounce back, and I want it to be hard for me to change the shape of it. And it's getting really hard to push. That's how I know that my gluten is kind of all sticking together. It's bonded good. It almost wants to roll back on its own when I knead it. Okay, this is really starting to look good now. And it would probably be fine to stop it right here. One of the ways you can tell is it's super smooth. Has a little bit of spring back to it, and it sticks when you touch it, but it doesn't stick to you. It's tacky, I guess. But I had a spot on the back of my hand, oops, I pulled it off too slow, where I had dough stuck all over here. And every time I knead it, it pulls a little bit more of that off. And I was kind of using that as a gauge to tell when it got done. Because the gluten in the bread is getting really well formed, and it's actually pulling the stuff off of my hand that is not as well formed. I mean, it's almost completely clean. I got a little bit way over here, but not much. And it's also almost completely cleaned everything off of my mat. It's soft, it's smooth. At this point, it is very relaxing to knead it. I mean, it just, it feels good, and it's not sticking to my hand. And that's what you're looking for. When it gets to that point where it's easy and you're not struggling with it or fighting it, you know you've about got it kneaded enough. Now, like I said, kneading it by hand, you're not really in danger of over processing it. With your stand mixer, if you're using a stand mixer, you want to knead it for 5 to 8 minutes with a dough hook. And you really don't want to go any longer than that because it will get over processed. Okay, another way you can test it is you can stretch it out. And you should be able to stretch it out enough so that you can actually see light through it without it tearing. And I can see light through this. Oops, I stretched it a little too far. But I can stretch it out far enough that I can see light through it without it tearing. And that's what you want. If you can get it thin enough to see through it and it doesn't tear, then you've about got it. Now, it's still a little sticky. I could keep kneading it a little bit more. And, you know, there's a lot of people who say, you know, the only way to do it is a quarter turn, push with the heel of your hand, and you keep working it that way. Quarter turn, push with the heel of your hand away from you, quarter turn, push. But the truth is, however you work it by hand to get it to that point where it's stretchy, not sticky. Well, it's going to be sticky, but not, you know, it doesn't, you can work with it. You've got to get it to that point where you can hold it, work with it, and get that gluten to start forming strings. It does stick to your hands more if you pick it up, put it in your hands like this, but you could work it entirely like this. And I know a lot of people have arthritis. I do too. And that technique of doing the quarter turn and pushing and the quarter turn and pushing, if that doesn't work for you, find a technique that works for you. Okay, once you get your dough kneaded, where it's to that point where it's elasticy, where it's soft, where it's smooth, you're going to want to let it rise. And how long you let it rise is going to vary wildly. And how you let it rise is going to vary wildly. You do want to rub the outside of your dough with some kind of fat. You can use any kind of oil. You can use butter. Just about anything will work. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use butter because, like I said, it adds a lot of flavor to it. And you can only add so much fat. So any fat I add, I want it to add flavor to it. And you're going to wipe the whole outside of your ball of dough. Really, really good. Alright. And once you get it coated good, put it back in your bowl. And it's okay that there's a little stuff left in that bowl. It won't hurt anything at all. And you're going to let it rise. For, like I said, the time depends, I mean, it varies wildly. And it depends on the humidity, on how well you've worked your bread and activated that gluten and activated your yeast and got everything bonded together. And it's going to depend a lot on temperature. The cooler it is, the slower the bread will rise. But the slower it rises, the more the yeast works and the more flavor your bread will have. And there's a trick that bakeries use. They use a steam proofer. And what that steam does is it makes the crust really, really soft. And that's easy to do at home. Some of you probably noticed that I had a pot of boiling water on my stove when I started this. So all I'm going to do is sit that pot of water in the bottom of my oven. I'm going to cover my bread with a towel. And then I'm going to put my bread in my oven. The oven is cool. It's not turned on. But that pot of boiling water is going to make the oven just a little bit warm, which is going to make my yeast really grow. And it will make it rise in about an hour. But you want it to double in size at least. Now, it's okay if it gets a lot bigger at this stage. Once we punch it down and turn it into a loaf, there's a limit on how much you can let it rise. But right now, you can put it in the oven, and if you got to do something that takes an hour and a half or even 2 hours, that's okay. But it's probably going to take at least an hour. And you don't have to put it in your oven. You can just cover it and sit it on your countertop, sit it on top of the refrigerator. That's a nice, safe place usually. Keep stuff out of it. But you do want to put a towel over it, or you can cover it loose with plastic wrap or something. You don't want to cover it tight with plastic wrap. And you don't want to put it in an airtight bowl because your yeast is alive and it needs air to grow and activate and do its thing. So don't cover it airtight. Just put a towel over it or some loose plastic wrap, some wax paper, anything like that. But do cover it. You don't want anything getting in it while it's sitting there or anything, just to protect it, cover it. That will also keep it from drying out. You can cover it with a wet towel if you want. That will add a little bit of moisture in it, kind of the same way the steam proofer does. So I'm going to let this rise, and then we'll be back in about an hour to show you what it looks like and how to form it in a loaf. Our dough has been in the oven for about an hour now, covered with a towel, with our pot of hot water, which gave it a little steam. It turned the whole oven steamy. And like I said, that's just to make the crust a little more tender. You can do that or not. And it has definitely doubled. You saw how big it was when I put it in there and how big it is now. I'm using the small stainless steel pot that I have on my stove back here. I read a lot of stuff that said heat water or boil water in a cast iron pan and put it in the oven. Heaven's sakes, that will ruin your cast iron pan. And in fact, when David was making bread at yesteryear, he tried doing water in a cast iron pan in the oven, and it destroyed it. It took me forever to get the rust out of that pan, and it really never was right again. I mean, he might have gotten it re-seasoned by now, I don't know. But it made a mess out of it. So don't use your cast iron unless maybe you've got an old pan, that one of the cheap ones or something, that you don't mind it rusting, because it will destroy it. It's much better to use a stainless steel pan. At this point, I'm going to put a little bit of butter on my hands to grease my hands to handle this, because I don't want my hands to stick in my dough. You can use, like I said again, any kind of oil or fat, and you don't want to get carried away with it, just a little. Just make my hands nice and greasy. This will make my hands nice and soft too. I've been working outside. Now, obviously, I've had my hands all in this dough, so it should go without saying that you need to make sure your hands are extra clean when you're making bread. And that's not just because you have your hands all in the dough, but you don't want to get bacteria off your hands in your bread. The yeast will feed off of that. I called my dad and asked him if he had any tips that I should pass on to you. And he didn't have a whole lot. I know I mentioned it in the book that he baked bread for several years at a local college. But he said this stage here is really important. He said that you want to make sure you work it enough to squeeze out all the big bubbles, because if you have big bubbles left in it at this point and you form it into a loaf, when you bake your bread, you'll have great big bubbles in your bread, and it's awfully hard to make a sandwich on bread that has a big hole in it. The biggest tip that the two of us could come up with together was be patient when you're making bread. Give it time to rise. Give it time to bake and get done. He said that when he was doing bread years ago at home, he did a 45-minute method. Everything was 45 minutes. He let it rise 45 minutes, which was what we just did. Then he let it proof in the loaf for 45 minutes. And there's a big old bubble right there. And he baked it for 45 minutes. Then he let it cool for 45 minutes before he cut it. Well, 45 minutes really has not been enough for my loaves to rise. Once I form it in a loaf and I proof it, it has always taken at least an hour for it to rise up enough to bake it. And it could take even longer than that. Like I said, it depends a lot on temperature, humidity, even barometric pressure. So just give it time. You're going to have to look at it, make sure it has at least doubled, and it needs to come up out the top of your pan before you start baking it. Now, you don't have to put this in a pan. You can put this, just take it just like this and sit it on a cookie sheet. You can take this dough and divide it up into smaller pieces and form it into hoagie buns, hamburger buns, hot dog buns, anything like that that you want. You can use this dough to make all your buns. You don't need a different recipe for those. It would just change the baking time and the way you shape it. I don't recommend baking this in a glass pan. I tried because I knew I was going to get that question. When I baked mine in a glass pan, it kind of came out soggy, and I don't know what the difference is, but the glass pan didn't work great. So you do want a metal pan, and you want to put some oil, some butter, some grease, something in it. Now, like I said, just at this point, you don't want to overwork it, but you want to make sure you get all those bubbles out, and then you're just going to kind of shape it into a loaf shape and put it in your pan. and you're going to put it back in the oven. And you want to be gentle with it. You don't want to really get down and do that real hard knead with the heel of your hand again. And I'm going to put this back in the oven with the water to steam it. Now, you don't have to do that. You can just leave it sitting right here on your countertop. You want to cover it back up again. You want to cover it with the towel, or you can use some plastic wrap. I talked about that before. I've put just a little bit of butter on the top of my plastic, or on the bottom of my plastic wrap, because I'm going to lay it over this way, because I don't want this to stick to my bread. And I'm going to use the plastic wrap instead of the towel because I want to be able to see it without touching it. Now, you don't want to cover this tight. I said before that the yeast is alive and it needs oxygen. So I'm going to wrinkle mine up enough so that it has a little gap at both ends. I also want my steam to get in there because I'm going to put it back in the oven and let that steam get in so my crust is nice and soft. Once you get the air bubbles squished out and you shape it into a loaf, or you put it on a cookie sheet, you know, you can make it round if you put it on a cookie sheet. You can shape it into different kind of buns, put it on a cookie sheet or in a small pan and bake it. If you're doing buns, if you have a pan that will fit the buns you're making so it can only spread out so much, that's a good idea, because they will tend to spread out and be really flat and really big if you don't have some way to kind of stop them. And it's okay if they touch if you're making buns. You know, if you get buns that are from the grocery store, the hot dog buns are all touching and the hamburger buns are all touching, you know, leave room for them to rise. But if you can fit them in a pan so that they can only go so far, that kind of helps to shape them better. And we're probably going to do a video where we do some buns. We just won't go into as much detail on how to make the bread. Just mark this bread video because I'm trying to get all the method in this video. So I'm just going to put this back in the oven, or leave it sit, or whatever you want to do, and keep an eye on it. Now, like I said, my dad did his 45 minutes. He got it in 45 minutes because he was using an old gas oven that had a pilot in it, so it was really warm all the time. Bakeries, sometimes they can get it in like 45 minutes because they have a heated proofer. It depends on a lot. It usually takes at least an hour for mine to rise up enough, and it could take an hour and a half. So the biggest tip I can give you is be patient with this proofing. You want it to rise enough. If it doesn't, your bread will be very dense. And we'll be back when this has risen enough. My bread's been in the oven proofing for only about 45 minutes. After I said 45 minutes wasn't usually enough time for me. That's why I said you have to keep an eye on it, because the proofing stage is kind of critical and it varies. If your bread rises up too much, it will fall, and, well, that's no good. If it does rise up too much, if something happens and you forget it, you can always press the bubbles out and let it rise a third time. But if you don't let it rise enough, it's going to be really dense. So you do want it up above the top of the pan. And this has only been in there for about 45 minutes. And I've got little beads of moisture all over the bottom side of my saran wrap here because I had the water in the oven. And like I said, you don't have to do that. It's entirely up to you. Now, there's a lot of stuff that you can add to the crust. You can brush it on before you bake it. I'm not going to do any of that because I did use a little butter. You remember when I formed it in the loaf, I had butter on my hands. And I also had butter on it when I formed it into the ball, and I put it in the bowl and let it rise. Now, you want to preheat your oven, 350 degrees. And I'm going to bake this for 45 minutes. Now, I put a whole lot of stuff in here that I said cause the crust to brown. The honey causes it to brown, the milk causes it to brown, the egg causes it to brown. So if I leave this in the oven for 45 minutes, when I take it out, my crust is going to be the color of this mat that I used to knead it on. And that's not going to be good. So what I'm going to do is I have some aluminum foil that I just folded the corners up on. And once my crust is set and brown, after about 20 minutes, I'm just going to sit this over my dough, and that will stop it from browning, but I can continue to bake my bread. So if you put extra stuff in it, you might want to tin it after about 20 minutes. Now, if you just do the basic, the flour, the salt, the yeast, and the water, you might not need to do that because your crust won't get as brown. And whether you're doing the basic recipe or you're adding some stuff in like I did just to kind of enhance the flavor, or you want to do a sweet bread or an herb bread, this makes some excellent cinnamon raisin bread, and we will probably do that video. I don't do that a whole lot because when I make cinnamon raisin bread, I enjoy half of it while it's warm with butter on it, and the other half of it the next morning with toast and put butter on it. And that's not really good for you to eat that much bread. But anyway, another thing that you've probably seen people do, especially in bakeries, is they cut slits in the top of it. Well, that's not just for decoration. What that does is it allows your bread to rise more, so it's a little bit lighter. After it starts to bake and the crust starts to set, it can continue to rise and expand. Now, you can do it with a sharp knife, but I sharpen my knives every single day and they still aren't sharp enough. I really keep my knives sharp. I sharpen them every time I use them. You can get a fancy tool in kitchen stores that has a razor blade in it that's just for cutting those slits in bread. Or you can just go to the Dollar Tree and buy you a razor knife. But if you buy a razor knife at the Dollar Tree or Walmart or wherever, these are not manufactured for use in the kitchen, and they usually have a little machine oil on them. So clean it off. And I'm just using an alcohol pad to clean this off because I don't want machine oil or anything else that might be on this in my bread. And just wiping it with that alcohol pad carefully so you don't get your fingers will clean off anything that's on it, and it won't get in your bread. And that's a much less expensive option than going to a kitchen store and buying a fancy tool. And all you want to do is just about 3 little slits. And you don't need to go down deep. You're just trying to cut through the crust, because that crust is already kind of made a skin like on top of this. Now you can leave a pan of water in your oven while you bake your bread if you want to, and it'll keep the crust moist like I said, and you can brush your crust with different things if you want to. Milk and sugar, a little honey and milk, just a little honey and water, egg. You can do an egg wash on it, just all kind of things. But I'm not going to do anything like that, and I'm not going to leave the water in while I bake my bread. If you do leave the water in, make sure the pan is not touching the element in the bottom of the stove. While my oven is preheating, I want to look at some of the stuff. Look at all that steam that was on the bottom of my pan. That kind of makes the job easier. If you have one of these little nylon mats, they're just the little nylon cutting boards. They're $1. It does make cleanup a whole lot easier, and it makes it easier to knead the bread because it doesn't stick as bad to this, I don't think, as it does the countertop. A dough blade is really good, and if you're going to be making like buns, or you're doing 2-3 loaves at once, you can use this to cut the dough and separate it into pieces. It works really good. And for $1, a bowl big enough to mix it in is a great help. The spatula that I used, I really like it, and a whisk to whisk the flour and the salt stuff together, but that's up to you whether or not you want that. And you do want a rack to cool it on if you have one. If you don't have a rack to cool it on, sit it on a towel and let it cool. So let's put this in the oven for about 45 minutes, and then, like I said, after about 20, I'm going to cover it, and then we'll come back and show you how to get it out of the pan. Now, there's not like a poke test to test when this is done. When it's done, if you tap on it, it will sound hollow. And that's about the best advice I can give you to tell when it's done. Well, our bread is almost ready to come out of the oven, and I've got a few more tips for you on how to make it last as long as possible and make sure it comes out as good as possible. Number one is wash your hands anytime you're going to touch it. The number one thing that causes homemade bread to mold is bacteria on your hands. So from the minute you take it out of the oven, anytime you're going to slice it or anything like that, make sure you wash your hands really good. And that will make your bread last days longer. And number two is as soon as you take it out of the oven, you want to get it out of the pan. If you let it sit in the pan, it will sweat and get soggy, and that will cause it to mold faster. Number three, which is the hardest one, is you want to let it sit at least 20 minutes before you slice it. It gives it time to rest and really form. It'll still be warm in 20 minutes. You'll still be able to put butter on it and everything and have a piece of warm bread with melted butter on it. But give it that 20 minutes before you start slicing it. You want to let it cool completely before you wrap it up. And that'll take about 45 minutes, maybe even an hour. And then you want to wrap it up airtight. And if you do that, it will last for several days. Now, not as long as commercially made store-bought bread. That stuff will sometimes last a month. But it'll give you 5 days on it anyway. And good luck keeping homemade bread in your house for 5 days. Like I said, the hardest part of that is waiting that 20 minutes to cut it. So let's grab it out of the oven and see what it looks like. See, I used my foil. And it got really, really brown. And it rose up really, really nice. And see how easy it dumps out of the pan? Now it is hot. And you want to get it on that rack, because as soon as it touched the table, the top of it, it started pushing it down. So make sure you get it up on the rack and let it start cooling. And that rack keeps the bottom of it from sweating. If you just sit it down on the table or something like that, the bottom is going to sweat. If you don't have a rack, at least put it on a towel, and that will absorb some of that moisture and help keep the bottom of it from getting soggy. I hope after this craziness is all over, you continue to occasionally at least make some homemade bread. And like I said, this is a good time to kind of learn a new skill and maybe even take up a new hobby. I tried to give you every tip I could possibly think of that would make it last longer. Slice it as you're going to eat it, because if you do that, it will stay fresh longer. If you slice it all before you put it away, it will dry out in between the slices. It'll stay much fresher if you slice it as you need it. That's about all I can think of. But before we go, we got a little bit of channel business to take care of. First, we have a ton of new subscribers, and I want to welcome you all to the Hillbilly Kitchen. We are all very happy that you joined us. So thanks for subscribing. The other thing that we have, did a couple of t-shirts. I had the dark gray t-shirt, and then there was the green one that we did the giveaway on Teespring. The green one went to Pure Light. They sent me an email with that on it. I didn't pick that. And the gray one went to TN Bubba, Tennessee Bubba. So Teespring will take care of the green one. And Tennessee Bubba, if you will leave a comment with your address, I will get yours in the mail to you. I'm wearing my Easter t-shirt. I thought this bright yellow t-shirt just kind of said spring, and on the back it says He is risen, and I thought the bright color might get some attention if I wore it out, and maybe if people ask me about the front, I could tell them about the back. So maybe I'll get to wear it out next Easter. I know Easter is going to be really hard for all of us. So maybe in the comments, you could leave ideas for how you're going to be celebrating Easter this year, since it probably isn't going to be how you normally celebrate it. If you've come up with some creative way of doing it, maybe let us know. A lot of the churches around here, I don't know if they're doing it all over the country or not, but they're doing, they're calling it porch preaching or drive-up services where people are driving up in their car and the pastor's standing on the porch and preaching, and they have a few people singing, and that way they're still apart but they're together too. And some churches are doing the where everybody drives up and they stream it live, so you can tune in on Facebook or YouTube and you can hear it even if you're parked way back. So that's some ideas that people are doing. Maybe you've got some other ideas that you can share in the comments. Kind of help us all get through this. And I've got something else. I have a couple of boxes here, and a lot of us, I know, we're trying to think of ways that we can help somebody else. I fill these up with non-perishable food. There's nothing fancy in there, but when I was doing it, I was really thinking about a lot of the people who are older who have already been isolated for almost a month now to try and keep from catching this. And I know a lot of y'all have to be running really low on supplies. If there's a couple of you out there who need this food, just in the comments, you don't need to give me an explanation or anything, just say I need it, and the first two people who say I need it, you can give me your address and I will ship this out. I know there's a lot more than two of you out there, and I will do as much as I can. We have 170,000 subscribers now roughly, and out of those, I know I think like 70% of you are over the age of 60, or maybe 60% are over the age of 60. So I know there's a lot of you that need this. I will do as much as I can. I have these two ready to go. I don't know how much more I will be able to get. But I got these last week before things got so bad here. Now there are continuing restrictions here. So like I said, I don't know how much more I'll be able to get. But if you need these two, just say I need it and give me your address, and I will mail these out to the first two people who ask for it. And you don't need to, like I said, do anything else. This is not really a giveaway. This is just something that I felt like I needed to do to help. That's all my tips for making homemade bread. Thank y'all so much for joining us in the Hillbilly Kitchen. Welcome to all of our new people. If you haven't already, please click like and subscribe before you leave. And until next time, remember to put God first.